There is nothing quite so cruel as hope, nothing so devastating as the moment when the tender dreams one has nurtured in the secret chambers of one's heart are dragged into the unforgiving light and trampled beneath the polished boots of indifference. Lady Arabella Thornwood understood this truth with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes only from experience, from standing in a glittering ballroom surrounded by 500 members of the ton, while the man she loved shattered her future with the casual cruelty of someone swatting away an inconvenient fly. 6 months had passed since that terrible night at Lady Pemberton's spring ball, yet Arabella could still feel the phantom weight of her silk gown against her skin, could still smell the cloying sweetness of hothouse flowers mingling with expensive perfume, could still hear the exact timbre of Lord Marcus Ashworth's voice as he stood not 20 feet from where she waited, her heart full of anticipation, and announced his engagement to Miss Cecilia Blackwood, heiress to one of the largest fortunes in England. She had loved Marcus with all the fervent devotion of her 23 years, had believed every whispered promise he had pressed against her gloved fingers during stolen moments in moonlit gardens, had trusted that the understanding between their families would soon be formalized into the engagement she had dreamed of since girlhood. She had been a fool, though she had not known the full extent of her folly until she heard Marcus speaking to Lord Fenimore, his voice carrying across the ballroom with devastating clarity, describing her as a pleasant diversion, certainly, but hardly wife material when one considers the state of the Thornwood finances. The laughter that followed had cut through her like shards of ice, and she had watched, frozen in place behind a marble column, as society absorbed the spectacle of her humiliation with the eager appetite that the ton reserved for the downfall of others. Arabella had not wept that night, had somehow found the strength to lift her chin and walk through the crowd with measured steps, had maintained her composure until she reached the privacy of her family's carriage, where she had finally allowed herself to crumble. She had loved Marcus Ashworth, had given him her trust and her hope and the innocent belief that romantic love could transcend the mercenary calculations of society matches, and he had repaid her with public scorn. The wound had festered in the months since, poisoning her faith in the tender emotions that poets celebrated and young ladies were taught to cherish, leaving her hollowed out and wary, a woman who now understood that love was merely another currency in the marriage market, one that could be spent and discarded when a richer offer presented itself. Her family's dwindling fortunes had made her vulnerable, had transformed her from a desirable match into a burden to be shed, and Marcus had shed her with the same ease with which he might have dismissed an unfashionable cravat. Arabella Thornwood had learned her lesson well, had buried her romantic dreams in the same grave as her trust, and had resigned herself to the bitter knowledge that she would never again be foolish enough to believe in love. The Thornwood family's decline had been gradual at first, a slow erosion of fortune that Arabella's father had hidden behind confident smiles and assurances that investments would recover, that debts would be repaid, that the family's standing in society remained secure. But the truth had a way of seeping through the cracks of even the most carefully constructed facades, and by the time Arabella fully understood the depths of their financial ruin, the creditors had already begun circling like vultures scenting carrion. Her father, once a proud man who had walked through the halls of Parliament with his head held high, now spent his days locked in his study, the sounds of his anguished pacing audible through the walls as he struggled with correspondence that brought only demands for payment and threats of legal action. The estate that had been in the Thornwood family for 6 generations was mortgaged to its foundations, the tenant farms producing barely enough to cover the interest on loans that seemed to multiply like weeds in an untended garden, and each month brought fresh humiliations as long-time servants had to be dismissed, with tearful farewells and promises of references that meant little when the family's name had become synonymous with failure. Arabella's mother had taken the strain hardest of all, her once vibrant complexion fading to a waxy pallor, her appetite diminishing until she seemed to exist on nothing more than weak tea and worry. The physician spoke of nerves and prescribed rest, but Arabella knew that the true illness was despair, the slow suffocation of watching everything one had built crumble to dust while society watched and whispered and gradually closed its doors. Young Sophia, Arabella's sister of 18 years, had seen her own prospects wither alongside the family fortunes. The young men who had once sought introductions now looked past her at assemblies, their mothers steering them toward more advantageous matches with the subtle ruthlessness that governed the marriage market. Society's whispers had grown louder in recent months. The Thornwood name passed from lip to ear in drawing rooms throughout London, always accompanied by pitying glances or, worse, the barely concealed satisfaction that some took in witnessing the mighty brought low. Arabella had quietly begun making inquiries about positions as a governess, understanding with clear-eyed practicality that her education and accomplishments, which had once been intended to make her an ornament to some nobleman's household, might now serve a more humble purpose. The thought of leaving her family, of becoming an employee in some stranger's home, while her mother faded and her sister's future dimmed, filled her with a grief she could not voice, but she had learned that survival sometimes required the sacrifice of pride. In the mornings, before the weight of their circumstances pressed too heavily upon her shoulders, Arabella would escape to her mother's garden, now tended only by her own hands since the gardeners had been let go. She found solace among the roses, particularly the wild varieties that grew in the far corner, their blooms imperfect and untamed, but possessed of a fierce beauty that the cultivated hothouse flowers could never match. These resilient creatures asked for nothing but soil and sunlight, thriving despite neglect, blooming despite circumstances that would have withered lesser plants, and Arabella found in them a kinship that she could not explain. She would kneel in the dirt, heedless of her fading dresses, and coax new growth from stubborn stems, finding in this simple work a peace that eluded her everywhere else, a reminder that beauty could persist even in the most unlikely conditions. That strength could be quiet and unassuming and still endure. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, was a name spoken in whispers throughout the drawing rooms of London, always accompanied by a shudder or a knowing glance that conveyed more than words ever could. He was cousin to Lord Marcus Ashworth, though the two men could not have been more different in temperament or reputation, for while Marcus charmed his way through ballrooms with easy smiles and honeyed words, Sebastian had become something of a spectre, a figure of dark legend that mothers invoked to frighten daughters away from unsuitable attachments. He had left England as a young man of 24, full of idealistic fervour and the burning desire to serve his country against Napoleon's forces, and he had returned, 3 years later, a changed creature entirely, bearing upon his face the terrible evidence of a cannon explosion that had killed half his regiment and left him hovering between life and death for months in a Portuguese field hospital. The scar carved a brutal path from his left temple down across his cheek, twisting the corner of his mouth into what appeared to be a permanent expression of displeasure, and society, which prized beauty and ease above all virtues, had recoiled from him with an instinctive revulsion that had never softened despite the passage of years. They called him the Stone Duke, this man who had once been known for his warmth and wit, because he had learned to encase his heart in armor as impenetrable as the walls of his ancestral estate, presenting to the world a facade of cold indifference that discouraged approach and invited speculation. The rumors that swirled about him were as varied as they were fantastical. Some whispered that the war had driven him mad, that he wandered the halls of Thornwood at night, howling at shadows, while others suggested a streak of cruelty that made him unfit for civilized company, and still others hinted at darker appetites that no decent woman should ever be forced to satisfy. None of these tales bore any relationship to truth, as his loyal servants could have attested had anyone thought to ask them, for they knew their master as a man of quiet generosity, who remembered the names of every child on his estate, who had paid for the education of promising tenants' sons, and provided pensions for widows without ever seeking acknowledgement or praise. He avoided society not from madness or cruelty, but from a weariness born of too many averted gazes, too many conversations that faltered when partners caught sight of his ruined face, too many years of understanding that he would forever be judged by the evidence of his sacrifice rather than the content of his character. Yet on one particular evening, drawn by obligation to a musicale he would rather have avoided, Sebastian found his attention captured by a young woman standing alone near a window, her posture straight despite the weight of sorrow that seemed to press upon her shoulders, her expression composed even as he watched others whisper behind their fans in her direction. He recognized her as the woman his cousin had so publicly discarded, and something stirred in his chest as he observed the dignity with which she bore her humiliation, the quiet strength that radiated from her despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. She did not notice him watching from the shadows, this Lady Arabella Thornwood, but Sebastian found that he could not look away, intrigued by the resilience he perceived beneath her careful composure, wondering what manner of woman could endure such cruelty and still hold her head high among those who had witnessed her disgrace. The morning the Duke of Ashworth's carriage appeared in the Thornwood Drive, Arabella was in the garden, her hands buried in soil as she coaxed a struggling rosebush back toward life, and she did not learn of his presence until the housemaid came running, with wide eyes and breathless words, about a duke in the parlour, asking to speak with her father on a matter of urgent business. She cleaned her hands and changed her dress with trembling fingers, curiosity and apprehension warring in her chest, for she could not imagine what business the notorious Stone Duke might have with her family, whose circumstances had rendered them beneath the notice of most of society's elite. She descended the stairs quietly, intending to inquire of her father after the visitor had departed, but the study door stood slightly ajar, and the voices within carried clearly into the hallway, where she paused, frozen by the sound of her own name spoken in a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Lady Arabella would want for nothing," the Duke was saying, his tone as businesslike as if he were discussing the purchase of livestock rather than a woman's future. "I would settle all your debts immediately upon the marriage, provide a generous allowance for your wife's care and your younger daughter's dowry, and ensure that the Thornwood estate remains in your family free of encumbrance." Her father's response was barely audible, strained with disbelief, and something that might have been hope or might have been shame. "Your Grace, I am not certain I understand the nature of this proposal. My daughter has no fortune, no connections that could benefit." "I am aware of Lady Arabella's circumstances," the Duke interrupted, and Arabella pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear it through the door. "I require a wife for practical reasons, to manage my household, to provide an heir to the dukedom, to silence the endless speculation about my solitary existence. I have no interest in the simpering debutantes the marriage market offers, girls who cannot look upon my face without flinching. Your daughter possesses qualities I have observed and found admirable: dignity, resilience, intelligence. This would be an arrangement of mutual benefit, nothing more." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, and Arabella found she could not breathe, could not move, could not reconcile the enormity of what she was hearing with the small, resigned future she had constructed for herself. Her father spoke again, his voice thick with emotion she had not heard from him in months. "I cannot make such a decision for my daughter, Your Grace. She is not chattel to be bartered, whatever our circumstances. The choice must be hers." Something shifted in the Duke's voice then, a note of what might have been respect entering its cold depths. "I would expect nothing less, Lord Thornwood. I shall return tomorrow for her answer, and I give you my word that whatever she decides, I will take no offense and exact no retribution. She may refuse me without consequence." Arabella stepped back from the door on shaking legs, her mind reeling with the impossible choice that had suddenly materialized before her, the chance to save everything and everyone she loved at the cost of binding herself to a man the world called monster. The night that followed the Duke's visit was the longest of Arabella's life, for sleep eluded her entirely as she lay in the darkness of her small bedchamber, turning the impossible choice over and over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by endless handling. She thought of her mother's pale face and trembling hands, of her sister's dimming hopes, of her father's shoulders bowed beneath the weight of debts he could never repay, and she thought too of the life she had imagined for herself before Marcus Ashworth had shattered her foolish dreams, a life of love and laughter and children born of genuine affection rather than cold arrangement. But that life had been revealed as illusion, a fairy story she had told herself, while ignoring the evidence that love was merely a pretty mask worn by those who sought advantage, and perhaps there was wisdom in accepting a bargain honestly presented, rather than trusting again in promises that would only be broken. When morning came, she sent word that she would receive the Duke in the garden, for she could not bear to conduct this conversation within walls that might contain her, and she needed the comfort of growing things around her as she faced a decision that would determine the entire course of her existence. He came precisely at the appointed hour, and she observed him carefully as he walked toward her through the overgrown paths, noting the way he moved with a soldier's controlled grace despite his injuries, the way his dark eyes swept the garden with an expression she could not quite decipher before settling upon her face with an intensity that might have frightened her had she not glimpsed something beneath it that spoke of vulnerability rather than menace. "You have considered my proposal," he said without preamble, his voice carrying that strange quality of roughness overlaid with something almost gentle, and she appreciated that he did not waste words on pleasantries neither of them would believe. "I have thought of little else," she admitted, clasping her hands before her to still their trembling. "But before I give you my answer, I must ask you something, Your Grace, and I require your honest reply regardless of how it might affect my decision." He inclined his head, a gesture of permission that contained none of the impatience she might have expected from a man of his station addressing a woman of her diminished circumstances. "You have spoken of what you can offer me: security, freedom, respect, but you have said nothing of what you expect from this arrangement beyond the practical matters of household management and heirs." She paused, gathering her courage, for the question she needed to ask was one that no proper lady should voice, yet she could not bind herself to uncertainty again. "I must know, Your Grace, will you be cruel to me?" The change that came over his face was subtle but unmistakable, a softening of the stern lines around his mouth, a flicker of something wounded in the depths of his eyes, as if her question had struck against old hurts he kept carefully hidden from the world. For a long moment he did not speak, and when he did, his voice had lost its gruff formality entirely, becoming instead something raw and quiet and achingly sincere. "Never," he said, and the single word fell between them like a vow more binding than any ceremony could create. "I have known cruelty, Lady Arabella, both given and received, and I have no wish to perpetuate it. You would have my protection, my respect, and my word as a gentleman that no harm would ever come to you by my hand or by my neglect." Arabella looked at him then, truly looked, past the terrible scar and the cold reputation, and she saw a man who had been honest with her when honesty was neither required nor advantageous, who had given her father the dignity of choice when he might have pressed his advantage, who stood before her now offering the one thing she needed most desperately to believe in: safety. "Then I accept your proposal, Your Grace," she said quietly, and watched something that might have been relief, or might have been hope, kindle briefly in his eyes before his expression resumed its careful neutrality, and she thought that perhaps she was not the only one in this garden who had learned to hide their heart behind walls of self-protection. The wedding took place on a grey morning in early autumn, the kind of day when the sky seemed uncertain whether to weep or merely brood, and Arabella thought it fitting that even the heavens could not decide what to make of this unexpected union between a fallen family's daughter and the most feared duke in England. The church was small and ancient, chosen by Sebastian for its privacy rather than its grandeur, and the guest list had been ruthlessly culled to include only those whose presence was absolutely required by propriety: her parents, her sister, a handful of Sebastian's distant relations who attended more from curiosity than affection, and a few members of society whose invitations could not be refused without causing the very gossip Sebastian wished to avoid. Arabella wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slighter frame, its ivory silk aged to the color of cream, left too long in sunlight, and though it was not the fashionable confection she had once imagined wearing when she had dreamed of marrying for love, she found a quiet comfort in the weight of family history upon her shoulders. Sebastian waited at the altar in severe black, his scarred face composed into an expression of such careful neutrality that she might have thought him entirely unaffected, had she not noticed, as she drew closer on her father's arm, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained clasped before him with a rigidity that spoke of iron control rather than ease. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ancient words and flickering candlelight, and Arabella spoke her vows in a voice steadier than she had expected, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was securing her family's future with every promise that fell from her lips. But it was when Sebastian took her hand to slide the ring onto her finger that she felt the first crack in her careful composure, for his fingers trembled against hers with a vulnerability he could not entirely hide, and she realized with a start that the fearsome Duke of Ashworth was nervous, not cold, not indifferent, but genuinely, humanly anxious about this moment that bound them together. She looked up at his face, searching for meaning in those dark eyes, and found something there she could not name, something that made her heart beat faster, despite every rational argument she had constructed against such foolish reactions. The wedding breakfast that followed was a subdued affair, the conversation stilted and the silences heavy with unspoken speculation, and Arabella was acutely aware of every whispered comment, every sidelong glance, every raised eyebrow that followed her movements as the new Duchess of Ashworth. She had expected Marcus Ashworth's presence. Sebastian had warned her that his cousin would attend, propriety demanding the invitation, but nothing had prepared her for the sharp twist of pain that lanced through her chest when she saw him enter the room with Cecilia on his arm, his handsome face arranged in an expression of polite boredom that did not quite reach his calculating eyes. Cecilia looked brittle and unhappy, her smile too bright and her laughter too sharp, and Arabella felt an unexpected flicker of pity for the woman who had won the prize she herself had once coveted. Throughout the breakfast, she sensed Marcus watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with discomfort, and when their eyes finally met across the room, she saw something flicker in his expression, regret, perhaps, or covetousness, or simply the wounded pride of a man who could not bear to see something he had discarded claimed by another. She did not realize Sebastian had noticed until she felt his hand settle against the small of her back, warm and solid and unexpectedly reassuring, a gesture so natural that anyone watching might have believed theirs was a love match rather than a bargain struck in desperation. She glanced up at him in surprise and found him looking not at her but at Marcus, his scarred face hard as granite, and in that moment she understood that, whatever else this marriage might lack, she had gained a protector who would stand between her and those who wished her harm, and the warmth of his hand against her spine felt less like possession than like promise. Thornwood Hall rose from the English countryside like a great stone sentinel, its grey walls and countless windows speaking of centuries of wealth and power and solitude, and as the carriage bearing Arabella through the imposing iron gates began its long approach up the gravel drive, she felt the weight of her new position settle upon her shoulders with an almost physical heaviness that stole the breath from her lungs. The estate was vast beyond anything she had imagined, rolling parkland giving way to formal gardens that even in their current state of careful maintenance seemed somehow melancholy, as if the grounds themselves had absorbed the loneliness of their master and now exhaled it back into the autumn air like a perpetual sigh. Sebastian sat beside her in silence, his scarred profile turned toward the window, and she wondered what memories this homecoming stirred in him, what ghosts walked these halls that she had yet to meet. When the carriage finally halted before the great front doors, a line of servants stood waiting in precise formation, their faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality that could not quite disguise the curiosity burning in their eyes, and Arabella descended on legs that trembled only slightly, drawing upon every lesson in deportment her mother had ever taught her to present the picture of a duchess confident in her new domain. Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper, stepped forward, first a woman of perhaps 50 years with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing, yet whose curtsy held genuine warmth rather than mere formality. "Welcome to Thornwood Hall, Your Grace," she said, and something in her voice made Arabella feel that the welcome was sincere, that this woman at least did not view her as an interloper or a curiosity, but as something the household had been waiting for without quite knowing it. The tour that followed revealed room after magnificent room, each more overwhelming than the last, until Arabella's head spun with the effort of remembering which corridor led where and which rooms were hers to command. But it was when they passed a set of French doors leading to the rear grounds that her breath caught in her throat, for there, visible through the glass, lay a rose garden in a state of beautiful ruin, beds overgrown with weeds, arbors sagging beneath the weight of unpruned climbers, paths nearly obscured by encroaching grass, and something in her heart recognized it instantly as a place that had once been loved and was now abandoned to grief. "The rose garden has not been maintained for some years, Your Grace," Mrs. Brennan said quietly, following Arabella's gaze with an expression of carefully guarded sadness. "His Grace does not. That is, it was his mother's particular joy, and since her passing." She trailed off, leaving Arabella to understand what words could not convey. That evening, dinner was served in a dining room far too large for 2 people, the candlelight casting dancing shadows across Sebastian's face as they sat at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 30. The silence stretched between them, not hostile but uncertain, until Sebastian cleared his throat and asked, in that gruff voice she was beginning to recognize as his armor against the world, what pursuits had occupied her time before their marriage, and Arabella found herself speaking of books and gardens and the small pleasures that had sustained her through difficulty and though he offered little of himself in return, she noticed that he listened with an attention that suggested her words mattered to him, and when she finally retired to her chambers, elegant rooms that smelled of lavender and possibility, she thought that perhaps this vast and lonely house was not so very different from its master. Imposing on the surface, but waiting, perhaps, for someone patient enough to discover what lay beneath. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Arabella had not anticipated, a quiet domestic pattern that was neither the passionate romance of her girlhood dreams nor the cold tolerance she had steeled herself to expect, but something altogether more mysterious, a marriage conducted in small gestures rather than grand declarations, in kindnesses performed in shadow rather than proclaimed in light. It began with the books, volumes she had mentioned only in passing during their awkward evening conversations, appearing on the small table beside her favorite chair in the sitting room, as if placed there by phantom hands, their spines uncracked and their pages waiting for her touch. She had spoken once of her love for Gothic novels, confessing it with the embarrassed air of one admitting to an unseemly vice, and within days a collection of Mrs. Radcliffe's works materialized, followed by translations of German tales she had never been able to afford, each one a silent acknowledgement that someone had been listening, truly listening, to words she had barely expected to matter. Then came the tea, the particular blend of jasmine and bergamot her mother had always favored, the one small luxury the Thornwood household had clung to until even that became impossible, suddenly appearing at every breakfast and afternoon service as though it had always been the custom of Thornwood Hall. When Arabella mentioned it to Mrs. Brennan, the housekeeper merely smiled and said that his Grace had sent to London for it specially, and something in Arabella's chest tightened at the thought of Sebastian remembering such a trivial detail, of him caring enough to act upon it without ever expecting acknowledgement or gratitude in return. But it was the matter of her mother's physician that undid her composure entirely, for when she received a letter from home describing how a renowned doctor from Harley Street had arrived unannounced to attend to Lady Thornwood, refusing all payment and claiming only that his services had already been secured by an anonymous benefactor, Arabella knew with absolute certainty whose hand lay behind this generosity, and she found herself weeping in her chambers with an emotion she could not name gratitude, certainly, but something else besides, something that felt dangerously like the stirring of a heart she had believed too damaged to stir again. She began watching Sebastian more carefully after that, observing him when he thought himself unobserved, and what she witnessed dismantled every assumption society had planted in her mind. She saw him pause in the hallway to help a young housemaid retrieve linens she had dropped, his scarred face patient rather than irritated as he bent his tall frame to assist her. She saw him increase the wages of the cook's assistant without announcement when the young man's wife fell ill, the information reaching Arabella only through the grateful whispers of the servants' hall. And one Sunday afternoon, following the sound of a low voice through the corridors, she discovered him in a small parlor at the back of the house, seated beside an ancient woman with clouded eyes, reading aloud from a volume of poetry with a gentleness that transformed his harsh features into something approaching tenderness. She withdrew before he could see her, her heart pounding against her ribs, but she carried that image with her like a secret treasure, and at dinner that evening she looked at him across the vast expanse of polished mahogany and wondered how many other hidden kindnesses lay buried beneath the stone exterior that had earned him his terrible nickname, and whether she might, if she were patient enough, be permitted to unearth them all. The question rose to Arabella's lips one morning at breakfast, propelled by weeks of watching the neglected rose garden through every window that afforded a view of its beautiful decay, and though she had rehearsed the words a dozen times in her mind, they still emerged hesitantly, almost apologetically, as she set down her teacup and asked Sebastian if he might permit her to restore the garden to its former glory. The effect of her words was immediate, and striking his hand stilled upon his newspaper, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he lifted his gaze to meet hers, she saw something flicker in those grey depths that spoke of old wounds torn fresh, of memories that still possessed the power to draw blood even after all these years. For a long moment he said nothing, and Arabella felt certain she had trespassed upon forbidden ground, had stumbled unknowing into a grief she had no right to disturb. But then he inclined his head in a single stiff nod and said only, "Do as you wish," before returning his attention to his newspaper, with a deliberateness that foreclosed further discussion. He avoided the garden entirely after that. She noticed taking different routes through the house, never passing the French doors that looked out upon the overgrown beds, as if the very sight of someone caring for that abandoned space caused him pain he could not bear to witness. But Arabella found herself drawn to the work with an intensity that surprised her, rising early to labor alongside the gardeners, her hands deep in soil that had not been properly tended in over 15 years, coaxing life back into bushes that had grown wild, and removing the weeds that had choked paths once walked by a woman she had never known, but was beginning to understand through the garden she had left behind. There was peace in the physical labor, in the ache of muscles and the dirt beneath her fingernails, in the slow revelation of beauty emerging from neglect, and she lost herself in it so completely that she did not hear Sebastian's approach one evening until his shadow fell across the bed. She was weeding, and she looked up to find him standing at the garden's edge, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of his Duchess kneeling in the dirt, with soil smudged across her cheek and her hair escaping its pins in wild tendrils. Something in his face shifted then, softened in a way she had never witnessed, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, thick with emotions held too long in silence. "My mother planted every rose in this garden herself," he said quietly, his gaze moving across the beds as if seeing not what was but what had been. "She died when I was 12, and I could not bear to look upon it afterward, so I let it fall to ruin rather than tend what her hands had touched." Arabella rose slowly, brushing the soil from her skirts, and met his eyes with a steadiness that belied the tenderness blooming in her chest. "Then we shall make it beautiful for her," she said simply, offering no platitudes, no excessive sympathy, only a promise spoken as fact. Sebastian held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, something raw and vulnerable flickering behind his careful mask, and then he turned and walked away without another word. But the next afternoon, glancing up from her work among the roses, Arabella saw him standing at his study window, watching her with an expression she could not name, but that warmed her more thoroughly than the autumn sun upon her shoulders. The invitation arrived on a silver tray, its creamy vellum and elegant script announcing Lady Whitmore's autumn ball as though it were merely another social occasion rather than the gauntlet. Arabella knew it to be their first public appearance as the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, the moment when society would gather to judge whether she had truly fallen so low as to sell herself to the scarred recluse they whispered about behind painted fans and gloved hands. She felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach as she read the words, remembering all too clearly the last grand ball she had attended, the cruel laughter that had followed Marcus's dismissal, the pitying glances and malicious whispers that had trailed her like a poisonous perfume through every subsequent social gathering until she had simply stopped attending altogether, retreating into the sanctuary of her family's crumbling estate rather than endure another evening of humiliation. Sebastian found her in the morning room, the invitation clutched in fingers that trembled slightly despite her efforts to still them, and something in his expression suggested he understood her fear without requiring explanation, understood it, perhaps because he carried his own dread of public scrutiny, his own memories of society's cruelty written permanently upon his face. "We must attend," he said quietly, and though his tone brooked no argument, she heard beneath it a note almost of apology, an acknowledgement that he was asking her to endure an ordeal for which neither of them possessed any enthusiasm. But when the evening of the ball arrived, Arabella discovered that Sebastian had been preparing for this moment with a thoroughness that stole her breath and brought unexpected tears to her eyes, for laid upon her bed was a gown of such exquisite beauty that she could only stare at it in wonder, deep emerald silk that seemed to capture the light and hold it, cut in the latest fashion, but with an elegance that transcended mere trend, accompanied by long gloves of matching hue and a velvet case that, when opened, revealed a necklace of pearls and emeralds so delicate and lovely that it could only have been a treasured heirloom. Missus Brennan, who had overseen the delivery with barely concealed delight, informed her that His Grace had sent to London 3 weeks prior for the gown, providing detailed instructions about the colour and style, and that the necklace had belonged to his mother, had not been removed from the family vault since her death, but had been cleaned and restrung specifically for this occasion. When Arabella descended the staircase that evening, transformed by silk and jewels and the careful ministrations of her lady's maid, into something approaching the woman she had once believed herself destined to become, Sebastian waited at the bottom, resplendent in severe black evening attire that emphasized his commanding presence, and as his gaze traveled over her, she saw something kindle in those grey depths that warmed her more thoroughly than any fire admiration. Certainly, but also a fierce protectiveness that spoke of battles he was prepared to fight on her behalf. "You will outshine them all," he said gruffly, offering his arm with formal precision, and though his tone was matter-of-fact rather than flowery, she understood suddenly what he was truly saying, understood that this gown and these jewels were armor he had fashioned for her, weapons against the cruelty of a society that had once cast her aside, and that in his own inarticulate way he was promising to stand beside her against whatever the evening might bring. Lady Whitmore's ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected endlessly in gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, and Arabella felt every eye upon her as she entered on Sebastian's arm, felt the whispers rise and fall like waves upon a shore as society took in the sight of the scarred duke and his unexpected bride adorned in emeralds that had not graced a woman's throat in 15 years. For a time, the evening proceeded better than she had dared hope. Sebastian remained close, his presence a shield against the more pointed stares, and several matrons approached with cautious courtesy that suggested her new rank demanded at least a pretense of respect, whatever their private opinions might be. But then Sebastian was drawn away by Lord Hartington to discuss some matter of parliamentary business, and Arabella found herself momentarily alone beside a towering arrangement of hothouse flowers, and it was in that vulnerable instant that Marcus Ashworth materialized at her elbow like a spectre from a nightmare she had believed herself finally escaping. "My dear Arabella," he murmured, his handsome face arranged in an expression of false concern that she now recognized as the mask it had always been. "I confess myself astonished to see you here, and in such finery, though I suppose one must dress the part when one has sold oneself to a monster." The words struck like physical blows, and Arabella felt the old wounds tear open beneath them, felt the humiliation of that terrible night 6 months ago rise in her throat like bile. But she forced herself to remain still, to betray nothing of the anguish his cruelty ignited. "One hardly knows what to say," Marcus continued, his voice pitched low enough that nearby guests could not hear, but loud enough to ensure she caught every poisonous syllable. "When confronted with such a desperate bargain, tell me, does he even share your bed? Or does he spare you the horror of looking upon that ruined face in intimate moments?" Arabella's hands trembled within her gloves, and she opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to defend Sebastian, but the words would not come, trapped behind the frozen wall of her shock and the treacherous voice in her mind that whispered, perhaps she deserved this mockery. Perhaps she had indeed sold herself for security and comfort, and had no right to pretend otherwise. "I believe," said a voice cold enough to freeze the very air, "that you are speaking to my wife." Sebastian stood behind Marcus, and though his tone remained perfectly controlled, something in his bearing spoke of violence barely leashed, of a soldier's instincts honed on battlefields far more dangerous than any ballroom, and Marcus paled visibly as he turned to face the Duke's terrible regard. "I suggest you listen carefully, cousin, for I will say this only once," Sebastian continued, and though he did not raise his voice, the guests nearest them had fallen silent, sensing the drama unfolding in their midst and straining to hear every word. "I am honored beyond measure to call Lady Arabella my wife, honored that a woman of such grace, such intelligence, such extraordinary worth consented to join her life with mine. Any man who failed to recognize what stood before him, who cast aside a treasure beyond price for the shallow glitter of mere fortune, is a fool of the highest order and deserving of nothing but pity." He stepped forward, and Marcus stumbled backward, his practiced composure crumbling before the Duke's quiet fury. "I would suggest you tend to your own clearly unhappy marriage before presuming to comment upon mine, and if you ever speak to the Duchess again with anything less than the utmost respect, you will discover precisely how I earned my reputation on the battlefield." The silence that followed Sebastian's words stretched through the ballroom like a held breath, every fan frozen mid-flutter, every whispered conversation extinguished beneath the weight of what society had just witnessed. The scarred Duke, whom they had pitied and feared and mocked behind his back, defending his wife with a ferocity that revealed depths none of them had suspected, while Marcus Ashworth, golden and charming and universally admired, stood exposed as something petty and cruel and unworthy of the regard he had so long enjoyed. Marcus retreated through the crowd without another word, his handsome face mottled with humiliation, and Arabella watched him go with a curious sense of something loosening in her chest, some knot of shame and unworthiness that had bound her since that terrible night 6 months ago, finally beginning to unravel beneath the realization that she had not been the one found wanting after all that Marcus's rejection had revealed his own poverty of character rather than any deficiency in her worth. The whispers began again, but they were different now, carrying notes of reassessment and grudging admiration as society processed what they had witnessed, and when Sebastian turned to her and extended his hand with formal grace, asking if she would honor him with a dance, Arabella placed her trembling fingers in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor while the orchestra struck up a waltz. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps even difficulty given his injury, but Sebastian moved with fluid assurance, guiding her through the steps with a confidence that spoke of hours of private practice and the realization that he had prepared for this, that he had anticipated this moment when she would need to hold her head high before the watching eyes of the ton, and had ensured she would have a partner worthy of the occasion brought tears to her eyes that she blinked back with fierce determination. "You dance beautifully," she managed, and something almost like embarrassment flickered across his stern features before he replied that a gentleman should be prepared to partner his wife without causing her injury, though she suspected from the slight warmth in his grey eyes that her praise had pleased him more than he would ever admit. The carriage ride home passed in contemplative silence, the streets of London dark beyond the windows, and Arabella found herself studying Sebastian's profile in the flickering lamplight, seeing not the scar that had once seemed so forbidding, but the strong line of his jaw, the intelligence in his brow, the mouth that could deliver such devastating words in her defense. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft in the intimate darkness, "for what you said, for defending me when I could not find the words to defend myself." He turned to look at her, and in the shadows his expression was unreadable, though his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight of conviction that seemed to reach into her very soul and take root there among the wounded places Marcus had left behind. "No one will speak ill of you while I draw breath," he said simply, as though it were merely a statement of fact rather than a vow of protection that made her heart clench with emotions she had not expected and was not yet ready to name. Before she could think better of it, before caution or propriety could intervene, Arabella reached across the space between them and laid her gloved hand gently against his scarred cheek, feeling him freeze beneath her touch as though she had struck him rather than caressed him, his entire body going rigid with shock and something that might have been fear of rejection. She realized with sudden clarity, fear that even this gentle gesture would end in revulsion when she truly felt what the war had done to him. But she did not pull away, and after a long moment she felt him lean almost imperceptibly into her palm, his eyes closing briefly as though her touch were water to a man dying of thirst. And in that small surrender, Arabella understood that whatever their marriage had begun as, it was already becoming something neither of them had anticipated. The days following Lady Whitmore's ball brought a transformation so gradual that Arabella could not have marked its precise beginning, only that she woke one morning to realize that the vast halls of Thornwood Hall no longer felt like a beautiful prison, but rather like a home, and that the man she had married for security had become someone whose presence she sought rather than merely tolerated. They began taking breakfast together, a practice that had started when Sebastian appeared in the morning room one day, claiming that eating alone had grown tedious, though the faint color in his cheeks suggested the excuse was merely a pretense for seeking her company, and from there it seemed natural to extend their time together into morning walks through the grounds, into afternoons spent reading in companionable silence in the library, into evenings of conversation that stretched long past the proper hour for retiring. Sebastian revealed himself to her in pieces, like a man unaccustomed to sharing anything of his inner self, but unable to resist the gentle persistence of her interest. He spoke of his love for astronomy, of the nights he spent in the small observatory his father had built, mapping stars and finding solace in the vast indifference of the heavens to human suffering. And he showed her the telescope through which she saw the rings of Saturn for the first time, her gasp of wonder drawing from him a smile so genuine it transformed his stern features entirely. He spoke too of darker things, of the guilt that haunted him still for the men he had lost in battle. young soldiers whose faces he remembered with terrible clarity and whose deaths he reviewed endlessly in his mind, searching for the decisions he might have made differently, the orders that might have saved them, and Arabella listened without offering false comfort, understanding that some wounds required witnessing rather than healing. In turn, she found herself sharing confidences she had never spoken aloud, her fear that Marcus had been right, that she was somehow insufficient, that even her own family's love was not enough to make her worthy of being chosen for herself rather than for what she might bring to a marriage, and Sebastian listened with an intensity that made her feel as though her words mattered, as though her wounds were worthy of attention. They understood each other's brokenness in a way that required no explanation. Two people who had learned that the world could be cruel and who had built walls accordingly, now discovering that those walls might have windows after all. One evening, as autumn painted the grounds in gold and crimson, and they sat together in the drawing-room while rain traced silver paths down the window-panes, Arabella made some observation about a character in the novel they were discussing. She could not afterward remember what she had said, only that it had been slightly impertinent, and Sebastian laughed, a real laugh, unexpected and rich and utterly transforming, and the sound moved through her like music, like the first warm day after a long winter, and she realized with sudden, startling clarity that she had never heard anything more beautiful in her life, that she wanted to spend whatever years remained to her finding new ways to draw that laugh from him again and again. She found him late one night when sleep had eluded her, and she had wandered downstairs in search of warm milk, only to see the flicker of candlelight beneath the study door and feel some instinct draw her toward it rather than away, some understanding that the man beyond that door might need her presence even if he would never ask for it himself. Sebastian sat in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace, a glass of brandy untouched on the table beside him, his eyes fixed on some distant point that Arabella knew was not within this room at all, but rather somewhere far away, in some blood-soaked field in Spain, where young men had died and left their ghosts to follow the survivors home. She did not speak, did not ask what troubled him, simply crossed the room on silent feet and settled into the chair across from him, tucking her feet beneath her dressing gown and letting the silence stretch between them, like a bridge he might choose to cross when he was ready. Minutes passed, perhaps an hour, marked only by the guttering of candles and the distant sound of the clock in the hallway, and then finally Sebastian spoke in a voice roughened by memory, telling her of the battle at Badajoz, of the explosion that had torn through his regiment like the wrath of an angry god, of the searing agony that had consumed the left side of his face, and the weeks of fever that followed, when death would have been a mercy he was not granted. He spoke of the surgeon who had saved his life through sheer stubborn refusal to let another officer die on his table, of the months of recovery in a Portuguese monastery, where kind monks had changed his bandages and fed him broth, and never once flinched from the ruin of his features, and of the terrible day when the bandages came off for the last time, and he saw in the mirror what he had become, a monster from a Gothic novel, a creature designed to frighten children and send women fleeing. And then he told her about Lady Catherine Ashworth, cousin to Marcus, and the woman Sebastian had loved since boyhood, to whom he had written every week from the front, and who had promised to wait for him, no matter how long the war might last. He told her how Catherine had been there when he returned to England, how she had rushed forward to greet him with joy on her face that transformed to horror the moment she saw what remained of his features, how she had actually screamed, had stumbled backward with her hand pressed to her mouth, and then had turned and fled the room without a single word, and how that single moment had taught him more about his place in the world than all the years of his life before combined. "I learned then," Sebastian said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old grief accepted but never forgotten, "that I would never be wanted, only tolerated, that the best I might hope for was a practical arrangement with a woman who could steel herself to endure my presence in exchange for the comforts my fortune could provide." Arabella rose from her chair and crossed to kneel beside him, taking his scarred hand in both of hers and pressing it against her heart, letting him feel its steady beating as she spoke the truth that she had come to understand with more certainty each passing day. "Your scar is not a mark of horror but of courage," she said firmly, "a testament to the price you paid for duty and honor and the lives of the men who came home because of your leadership, and I see you more clearly every day, Sebastian, past the walls you have built and the armor you wear against a world that judged you so cruelly, and what I see is good, what I see is worthy, What I see is a man far more deserving of love than those who have more pleasing faces but shallower souls." He stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue, as though her words could not possibly mean what they seemed to mean. And then his composure finally cracked, and he gathered her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and longing. And Arabella held him close and let him tremble against her, understanding that this was a gift she could give him, not pity, never pity, but acceptance, complete and unwavering and utterly true. The rose garden had reached its full glory when Sebastian came to find her there, the autumn sun warming the last blooms of the season into a riot of crimson and gold and palest pink that seemed to glow with an inner light. And Arabella looked up from the bush she had been pruning to see him standing at the entrance to the garden with an expression on his face that she had never seen before, something raw and unguarded and almost frightened, as though he were approaching a cliff's edge and could not decide whether to step back to safety or leap into the unknown. She set down her shears and rose, brushing soil from her gardening apron, and waited as he walked toward her with steps that seemed to require tremendous effort, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, in a rhythm that spoke of nerves she had never imagined the composed Duke of Ashworth could possess. "Arabella," he began, and then stopped, his jaw working as though the words he needed were lodged somewhere deep within him and refused to emerge. And she had never seen him struggle, so this man, who commanded rooms with his presence, who had faced cannon fire without flinching, who had endured the cruelty of society with stoic dignity, now standing before her, as vulnerable as a boy confessing his first transgression. "I find that I must speak," he continued, his voice rough and halting, "though I have never been skilled with words, though I fear that what I am about to say will change everything between us, and perhaps not for the better, but I have discovered that I am no longer capable of keeping this truth contained within me. And if there is one thing the war taught me, it is that life is too uncertain to leave important things unsaid." He took a breath that shuddered through his entire frame, and when he spoke again, his eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. "I entered our marriage expecting nothing but a practical arrangement, a wife who could tolerate my presence, a household managed with competence, perhaps eventually an heir to carry on the family name. I expected to live beside you in cordial distance, two people sharing a roof but nothing more, and I believed that this would be enough, because I had long ago accepted that nothing more would ever be possible for a man such as myself." His voice cracked on the final words, and he pressed on as though afraid that stopping would mean never finishing. "But you have undone me entirely, Arabella, you with your quiet strength and your gentle heart, and your absolute refusal to see me as the monster society named me. You have dismantled every wall I built and left me defenseless against feelings I thought myself incapable of experiencing." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the slight tremor in his scarred cheek, the desperate hope warring with desperate fear in his eyes. "I love you," he said, the words emerging as though torn from somewhere deep within his chest. "I have loved you perhaps since I watched you carry yourself with such dignity at that wretched ball, when my worthless cousin humiliated you before all of society, when I looked at you and saw not a woman defeated but a woman unbowed. And I vowed in that moment that someone should treasure you as you deserved, though I never imagined that someone might be me." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers trembling against hers. "I love you, and I will understand if you cannot return the feeling I ask for nothing. Expect nothing, demand nothing, but I could no longer keep this truth hidden from you, because you deserve honesty above all things, and the greatest dishonesty would be to stand beside you day after day, pretending that my heart does not belong to you, completely and irrevocably and forever." Arabella felt the world fall away around her, the roses and the autumn sun and the distant sounds of the estate all fading into insignificance, as Sebastian's words echoed through her heart like the tolling of bells, announcing some great and wonderful truth, and she found that her eyes had filled with tears, not of sorrow but of joy, so profound it seemed almost too vast to contain within her chest, too overwhelming to express through mere words, though words were all she had to offer in return for the gift he had just given her. "Sebastian," she breathed, and her voice trembled with the weight of everything she had been afraid to feel. Everything she had told herself was impossible, after Marcus's betrayal, had taught her that love was a cruel illusion designed to wound those foolish enough to believe in it. "I have been such a coward. hiding behind the walls I built to protect myself from ever being hurt again, telling myself that our arrangement was enough, that security and respect were sufficient, that I did not need or want anything more. But I have been lying to myself for weeks now, perhaps for months, because the truth is that I have fallen in love with you so completely that I can no longer remember what my heart felt like before you filled it. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the desperate hope flickering to life in his dark eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him that had become more precious to her than the finest perfume. "I love your hidden kindness," she continued, the words pouring forth now like water released from a dam. "The way you care for everyone around you while asking for nothing in return. The way you read to old Mrs. Patterson and remember every servant's birthday and send physicians to tend my mother without ever expecting thanks or acknowledgement. I love your quiet strength, the way you carry the weight of your responsibilities without complaint, the way you faced society's cruelty with dignity when lesser men would have hidden away entirely. I love your gentle soul that you guard so carefully from the world, but that I have been privileged to glimpse in our conversations, in our walks through the grounds, in every moment we have shared." She reached up and cupped his face in both her hands, her palms resting against the scarred and unscarred sides alike with equal tenderness, and she watched his eyes widen with something approaching wonder as she spoke her final truth. "I love you, Sebastian Blackwood, and I am done being afraid of that love." He made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and then his arms were around her, and his lips were on hers, and their first true kiss was everything Arabella had never dared to hope for, tender and passionate and desperate and reverent all at once, a claiming and a surrender, a promise sealed without words. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I do not deserve you." And Arabella laughed softly and replied, "Then we are well matched, for I thought the same of you." And he kissed her again as the roses swayed around them in the autumn breeze, as if nature itself celebrated their union. That night, when Sebastian came to her chamber, there was no awkwardness between them, no hesitation, only the natural progression of two hearts that had finally found the courage to recognize what they meant to each other, and Arabella discovered that intimacy with someone who truly cherished you was a revelation beyond anything she had imagined. Every touch, a declaration, every whispered word a vow, every moment a gift freely given and gratefully received. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart, Arabella told him quietly, "This is the first time in my life I have felt truly seen." And Sebastian held her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair, and replied in a voice rough with emotion, "And you are the only person who ever looked past the scar to find me the only one who ever truly wanted to." The transformation in the Duke of Ashworth was so complete, so undeniable, that even the most hardened gossips of London society found themselves forced to reassess everything they had believed about the man they once called the Stone Duke, for the gentleman who now appeared at social functions bore almost no resemblance to the cold and forbidding figure who had haunted the edges of ballrooms for years. This Sebastian Blackwood smiled, laughed softly at his wife's whispered comments, and looked upon the Duchess with such open adoration that Lady Whitmore herself declared to a gathering of matrons that she had never, in all her years, witnessed a better-matched couple, that the way the Duke's eyes followed his wife across any room spoke of a devotion that most marriages never achieved, even after decades. The Tun watched with fascination as Arabella bloomed under her husband's attentive care, her beauty seeming to increase with each passing week as happiness worked its magic upon her features, and where once society had pitied her for binding herself to a scarred recluse, now they envied her for capturing the heart of a man whose love was written plainly upon his face for all to see. Meanwhile, whispers of a different sort followed Marcus Ashworth and his wife Cecilia through every gathering they attended, for their fortune had diminished considerably due to Marcus's reckless gambling, and Cecilia's perpetually pinched expression and sharp tongue suggested a marriage devoid of any warmth or affection, their union serving as a stark counterpoint to the evident happiness of the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth. It was at Lady Pembroke's garden party, held on a glorious summer afternoon when the roses were in full bloom and the champagne flowed freely, that Marcus made his final desperate attempt to wound the woman who had once loved him. approaching Arabella when she stood momentarily apart from Sebastian, admiring a particularly fine climbing rose. "You seem content enough," Marcus said, his voice carrying that familiar poisonous undertone she remembered so well. "But I often wonder whether you think about what might have been, whether you lie awake at night imagining the life you could have had with a whole man rather than a scarred ruin. You could have been mine, you know, if only circumstances had been different." Before Arabella could respond, Sebastian appeared at her side, his presence calm and steady and utterly unruffled by Marcus's provocation, and he said nothing at all. Simply stood beside his wife with one hand resting gently at the small of her back, his very silence a more eloquent dismissal than any cutting remark could have been. Arabella looked at Marcus, truly looked at him, and found that the sight of him stirred nothing within her heart, except perhaps a distant pity for a man so incapable of recognizing genuine worth. "Lord Ashworth," she said quietly, her voice carrying the serene confidence of a woman completely secure in her happiness, "I have everything I could ever want: a husband who treasures me, a home filled with love, and a future bright with promise. I wish you the happiness you deserve." The words were perfectly polite, entirely proper, and devastatingly final, delivered with such quiet dignity that even Marcus understood he had been thoroughly and irrevocably dismissed, that the woman before him had moved so far beyond him that he could never hope to touch her again. And as he retreated with whatever remained of his dignity, Sebastian lifted his wife's hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers, while society watched and smiled and acknowledged what had become undeniably clear: the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth had found in each other something rare and precious and true. 3 years had passed since that golden afternoon in the rose garden, when two wounded hearts had finally found the courage to speak their truth, and Thornwood Hall had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered its former lonely grandeur scarcely recognized the estate that now hummed with warmth and laughter, and the particular chaos that only a house filled with love could possess. The corridors that had once echoed with Sebastian's solitary footsteps now rang with the patter of small feet and the delighted shrieks of a child at play, and the servants who had spent so many years worrying over their master's isolation now smiled constantly as they went about their duties, remarking to one another that the Duchess had brought the hall back to life in ways none of them had dared to hope for. Arabella's mother had made a remarkable recovery under the care of the physicians Sebastian had engaged, and she now resided in a charming cottage on the edge of the estate, where she could tend her own small garden and visit her grandchild whenever she wished, her health restored and her worries vanquished by the security her son-in-law had provided, without ever once making her feel beholden. Young Miss Thornwood, now Lady Catherine Hartwell, had made a love match of her own with a kind young baron whom Sebastian had quietly introduced to the family during a house party, a gentleman of modest fortune but exceptional character, who adored Catherine with the same devoted constancy that Sebastian showed Arabella, and the two sisters often spent afternoons together in the rose garden that had become legendary throughout the county for its beauty and its romantic history. It was in this very garden that Arabella stood on a warm September afternoon, her hand resting upon the swell of her belly where their second child grew, watching as her 2-year-old son Edward toddled determinedly through the flower beds with his father following patiently behind, and her heart felt so full she thought it might overflow entirely when she saw tiny fingers reach up to grab Sebastian's scarred cheek with the innocent fearlessness of a child who had never known his father to be anything other than the gentlest man in the world. Sebastian did not flinch from his son's touch, had never flinched from it, not even when Edward was a squalling infant who seemed determined to explore every inch of his father's face, and Arabella remembered with a bittersweet pang how he had wept silently the first time Edward had pressed a clumsy baby kiss to his scar, overwhelmed by the unconditional acceptance of a child who saw no monster, only his beloved papa. She watched now as Sebastian scooped their son into his arms, pointing out a butterfly dancing among the roses, his deep voice soft with patience as he answered the endless stream of questions that poured from Edward's lips, and she thought that the man society had once called the Stone Duke had become the most tender father she could ever have imagined, that the love he had kept locked away for so many years now flowed freely toward his family in an endless, abundant stream that showed no signs of ever running dry. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of amber, and rose as Arabella settled onto the stone bench on the terrace, her hand resting upon the swell of new life within her, while she watched Sebastian carry their drowsy son back toward the house. Edward's dark curls, so like his father's, resting against Sebastian's broad shoulder as the child surrendered to sleep with the utter trust that only a well-loved child could possess. And in this quiet moment between the golden light of day and the soft purple of approaching twilight, Arabella found herself reflecting upon the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place of perfect contentment, remembering with something almost like gratitude the broken woman she had once been, the woman who had stood in her mother's garden with dirt beneath her fingernails and despair in her heart, who had expected nothing from life but survival, who had accepted a marriage proposal, believing she was trading her dreams for security, and finding instead that she had stumbled into something far more precious than any dream she had ever dared to imagine. She remembered the whispers that had followed her acceptance of the Duke's proposal, the pitying glances, the dire warnings from well-meaning acquaintances who told her she was sacrificing herself to a cold and scarred recluse, and she thought now of how terribly wrong they had all been, how utterly incapable the world was of seeing past surfaces to the truth that lay beneath. For the man they called the Stone Duke had proven himself to be the warmest and most tender husband any woman could hope for, his love expressed not in flowery declarations, but in 1,000 small kindnesses. In the way he still ensured her favorite books appeared before she could request them, in the way he rubbed her aching feet without being asked, now that her pregnancy made standing difficult, in the way he looked at her across crowded rooms as though she were the only person present worth seeing. Sebastian returned as the last light faded, settling beside her on the bench and drawing her close against his side with the ease of long intimacy, and when she leaned her head upon his shoulder, she felt him press a kiss to her hair with the quiet reverence that still made her heart flutter even after years of marriage. "I have been thinking," she said softly, "about how different my life might have been if I had never accepted your proposal, and I find I cannot even imagine the woman I would be now. She seems like a stranger to me, that frightened girl who believed love was nothing but a path to pain." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her shoulder. "You saved me," he said finally, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I was so certain I would spend my life alone, that the war had taken from me any chance of happiness, and then you came and saw something in me that I had forgotten existed." Arabella lifted her head to look at him, reaching up to touch the scar that she had come to love as dearly as any other part of him, that mark of courage and survival that had once made the world recoil, but that she saw now only as evidence of his strength. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, and when he pulled her closer still, she thought that every warning, every doubt, every moment of suffering she had endured had been worth it to arrive at last in this place of perfect peace, wrapped in the arms of the man who had taught her that love, true love, was not the giddy infatuation of youth, but something deeper and stronger, a choice made daily, a commitment renewed with every sunrise, a garden tended faithfully until it bloomed beyond all expectation. The fire crackled softly in the hearth of the library at Thornwood Hall, casting warm, golden light across the scene that would remain forever etched in Arabella's heart. Sebastian settled in his favorite armchair, with young Edward curled upon his lap, the child's dark eyes growing heavy as his father's deep voice wove the familiar words of a bedtime story into the peaceful air, and Arabella herself resting upon the settee nearby, with her hand draped across her belly where their daughter, for she was certain this child would be a girl, turned and kicked with the spirited energy that seemed to run in their family. And in this moment of perfect domestic tranquility, she understood with crystalline clarity that she had been given a gift beyond all measure, that the broken pieces of her heart had been gathered up by gentle hands and made whole again in ways she never could have anticipated on that terrible night when Marcus Ashworth's cruel words had shattered her faith in love. She watched Sebastian's face as he read the way the firelight played across his scar, the way his expression softened with such profound tenderness when Edward's small fingers curled around his thumb, and she thought of all the warnings she had received, all the pitying glances and dire predictions, and she wanted to laugh at how utterly wrong the world had been, for they had looked upon the surface and seen only damage where the greatest treasure lay hidden beneath. They had judged by appearances and missed entirely the beautiful soul that dwelt within this man, whom society had dismissed as cold and ruined. Love, she had learned, grew best from the soil of respect and honesty, took root in the quiet moments rather than the grand gestures, flourished when tended with patience and watered with kindness, and what she and Sebastian had built together was stronger than any passion born of infatuation, deeper than any romance founded upon mere attraction, for they had seen each other truly scars, both visible and invisible, and had chosen one another not despite their wounds, but with full knowledge of them, finding in their shared brokenness not weakness, but the very foundation of an unshakable bond. Edward's breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep, and Sebastian rose carefully to carry their son to the nursery, pausing to press a kiss to Arabella's forehead as he passed, and in that simple gesture lived all the proof she would ever need that she had chosen well, that sometimes the heart finds its home in the most unexpected places, that those who judge by surfaces miss the greatest treasures life has to offer. And so, dear listener, as we take our leave of Arabella and Sebastian in their hard-won happiness, may their story offer you comfort in your own journey. May it remind you that love, when it comes from the right heart, is always worth the risk of hoping that the ones the world warns us against are sometimes the very ones who will cherish us most truly, and that every wounded soul deserves the chance to bloom again in the garden of genuine love. Thank you for walking this path with us, for believing in their story, and may you carry with you always the knowledge that your own happily ever after awaits, perhaps in the most unexpected of hearts.